Sir, you've been told to leave. You're loitering and making people uncomfortable.
This is public property. I'm waiting for someone. That's not a crime.
Don't argue with me. Show ID, now.
I've identified myself. You're escalating for no legal reason, officer.
Turn around. Hands behind your back.
Officer Kyle Vance had been patrolling the quiet, affluent streets of Oak Creek for 6 years when he made the decision that would implode his career and cost the taxpayers of his city $6.5 million. He was 29 years old, clean-cut, and carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed his badge granted him immunity from consequences. He had a reputation in the precinct, the kind that supervisors whispered about behind closed doors, but never formally addressed. He was proactive. He was aggressive. But to the community members who had the misfortune of crossing his path, he was a bully with a gun. On a bright, crisp Tuesday morning at the Oak Creek Farmers Market, Vance received a dispatch call regarding a suspicious individual refusing to leave a vendor's area. The individual in question was Marcus Thorne, a 58-year-old retired Marine Corps colonel and a high-ranking federal veteran liaison. He was standing near a cheese stall, leaning on his cane, waiting to approve a life-changing housing grant for a homeless veteran he had agreed to meet there. What Vance did next, ignoring Thorne's calm explanation, mocking his service-connected disability, and slapping handcuffs on a man who had commanded battalions in Fallujah, would become a viral case study in how unchecked arrogance and implicit bias can dismantle a police department's credibility in an afternoon. Before we get into the details, where are you tuning in from? If you believe in accountability for our public servants, hit that subscribe button. We need to keep telling these stories until the system changes. Officer Kyle Vance's personnel file was a minefield that the department had managed to dance around for half a decade. In 6 years, he had accrued 14 civilian complaints. 14. For context, the average officer in that department received 1 or 2 in a comparable period. Most of Vance's complaints followed a distinct troubling pattern escalation of nonviolent situations involving older men of color. There was the incident with the postal worker he detained for impeding traffic while delivering mail. There was the grandfather he threatened with a taser for asking why he had been pulled over. In every instance, Internal Affairs exonerated him or slapped him on the wrist with retraining, citing his high arrest numbers as proof of his effectiveness. Vance had convinced himself that he possessed a sixth sense for criminality, a gut instinct that superseded the Constitution. He believed that if someone made him feel disrespected, they must be guilty of something. This belief system was about to collide with a man who had spent 30 years defending the very rights Vance treated as optional suggestions. Marcus Thorne was not a man who sought attention. At 58, he moved with a deliberate, pained grace the result of a mortar explosion in 2004 that had shattered his left hip and ended his infantry career. He walked with a heavy polished oak cane, not as a prop, but as a necessity. Since retiring from the Marine Corps with full honors, a Silver Star and a Purple Heart, Thorne had dedicated his second act to the Department of Veterans Affairs. He wasn't a paper pusher, he was a fixer. His official title was Federal Veteran Liaison, a role that gave him broad authority to cut through red tape and authorize emergency funds for veterans in crisis. He reported directly to regional directors and had a phone book full of contacts that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. That Tuesday morning, Thorne was on a mission of mercy. He had spent 3 months trying to track down a young localized veteran named David, who was living out of his sedan and suffering from severe PTSD. David didn't trust government offices. He didn't trust hospitals. But he remembered the colonel. David had agreed tentatively to meet Thorne at the farmers market, a neutral open space to sign the paperwork that would get him into a transitional apartment that very night. Thorne arrived at 9:45 a.m., dressed in his usual uniform of off-duty command, pressed khaki slacks, a navy blue polo shirt tucked in with military precision, and polished loafers. He found a spot near the center of the market close to a stall selling artisanal cheeses where he had a clear view of the parking lot entrance. He checked his watch. He checked his phone. He leaned on his cane, scanning the faces of the crowd, looking for a frightened young man who needed help. He stood still, silent and patient, the way he had stood on watch 1,000 times before. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't eating. He was holding his post. And in the Oak Creek Farmers Market, standing still, while black was apparently enough to trigger an alarm. The alarm was sounded by Brent Miller, the 34-year-old owner of Miller's Artisanal Cheeses. Miller had taken over the family business 2 years prior and was obsessed with the aesthetic of his customer base. He wanted the market to feel like an exclusive club for the wealthy suburbanites who bought his $20 blocks of cheddar. Miller had been watching Thorne for 15 minutes. In Miller's mind, a black man standing in one spot without buying anything wasn't a customer. He was a threat. He wasn't waiting. He was loitering. He wasn't scanning for a friend. He was casing the cash box. Miller wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes narrowing as he watched Thorne check his watch again. "He's making people nervous," Miller muttered to himself, though the two women sampling Gouda in front of him seemed completely oblivious to Thorne's presence. Miller's bias filled in the gaps that reality left open. He saw the cane not as a medical device, but as a potential weapon. He saw Thorne's serious, focused expression not as concern for a fellow veteran, but as hostility. Miller decided he couldn't have this element ruining his Tuesday rush. He didn't walk over to ask if the man needed help. He didn't ask if he was waiting for someone. He pulled out his iPhone, ducked behind his display of jams and jellies, and dialed the police non-emergency line. But when the dispatcher answered, Miller didn't report a man standing still. He escalated the narrative to ensure a quick response. "Yes, this is Brent at the farmer's market. There's a guy here, he's been loitering right in front of my register for 20 minutes. He's refusing to leave and he's acting aggressive. He's staring down my customers. I think he might be casing the joint to rob us." The dispatcher asked for a description. "African-American male, late 50s, heavy build. He has a large stick or club with him. Please hurry, he's scaring the families." The call went out. "Disturbance at the farmer's market. Subject is a black male refusing to leave, possibly armed with a club. Aggressive behavior reported." Officer Kyle Vance was 3 blocks away. When he heard "refusing to leave" and "aggressive," his adrenaline spiked. This was what he lived for, taking out the trash. He flipped on his lights, not the siren, and sped toward the market. He arrived at 10:02 a.m., parking his cruiser halfway onto the curb near the entrance, a move designed to assert dominance before he even stepped out of the car. He slammed the door and adjusted his utility belt, marching into the crowded market with his hand resting near his holster. He didn't look for a manager. He didn't look for witnesses. He scanned the crowd for the description. He saw Marcus Thorne immediately. The older man was standing exactly where Miller had said, near the cheese stall, looking at his phone. To Vance, the image confirmed the crime. The man looked too big, too dark, and too stationary for this environment. Vance bypassed the cheese vendor entirely. He didn't ask what the specific behavior was. He walked in a straight line toward Thorne. His chest puffed out, his eyes locked on his target. Thorne, deep in thought about whether David would actually show up, didn't notice the officer until Vance was less than 5 feet away. The officer didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask a question. He issued a command. "Hey, you. We need to talk." Thorne looked up from his phone, his expression mild, barely registering the officer's aggression. "Excuse me." He asked, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that commanded respect in briefing rooms across the world. "I said we need to talk," Vance snapped, stepping into Thorne's personal space. "I've got complaints that you're harassing customers and refusing to leave. You need to move along, now." Thorne blinked, confused. He looked around. The market was bustling, but no one was paying him any attention. "Officer, I think you have the wrong person. I'm just waiting for a colleague. I haven't spoken to anyone." Vance shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "Don't play dumb with me. The owner says you're scaring people. You're loitering. This is private property." "Actually," Thorne said, shifting his weight on his cane to face the officer fully, This is a municipal lot rented by the city for the market, which makes it public property. And I'm not loitering. I'm conducting federal business." Vance laughed, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. "Federal business at a cheese stand? Listen, buddy, I don't have time for fairy tales. You're trespassing. You need to walk away right now or you're going for a ride." Thorne felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the same steel that had kept him calm under mortar fire. He realized exactly what was happening. This boy with a badge saw a black man in a polo shirt and decided he didn't belong. "I am not leaving," Thorne said, slowly enunciating every word. "I am Colonel Marcus Thorne, retired USMC, and currently a federal veteran liaison. I am waiting for a veteran who is in crisis. I am not going anywhere." Vance's face reddened. He wasn't used to suspects talking back with better vocabulary than he had. He stepped closer, his nose inches from Thorne's. "I don't care who you say you are. You're failing to comply with a lawful order. Let me see some ID, now." Thorne sighed a sound of profound disappointment. He shifted his cane to his left hand and reached into his back pocket. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Vance shouted, his hand dropping to his taser. People nearby stopped shopping. The chatter of the market died down. Heads turned. Thorne froze. "Officer, you asked for ID. My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly." "Do it. Slowly," Vance commanded, performing for the audience, now trying to show he was in control of a dangerous situation. Thorne retrieved his leather wallet. He didn't pull out a driver's license. He flipped it open to reveal his PIV card, the personal identity verification credential issued to federal employees, and his gold liaison badge. He held it up for Vance to see. "Department of Veterans Affairs, federal credential. Verify it." Vance glanced at the card. It had the hologram, the chip, the seal. It looked official, but Vance's ego had already written a check that reality couldn't cash. He couldn't be wrong. If he was wrong, he was the idiot harassing a colonel, so he decided he wasn't wrong. "That looks like something you printed off the internet," Vance scoffed, waving a hand dismissively at the federal ID. "I can buy a badge like that on eBay for $15. Try again. Give me a driver's license or I'm taking you in for failure to identify." Thorne stared at the officer, his eyes cold. "Officer, that is a federal government identification card. Refusing to acknowledge it is a violation of your protocol. I strongly suggest you call your supervisor or run the badge number before you make a mistake you can't undo." "Are you threatening me?" Vance stepped back, his voice raising an octave so the crowd could hear. "He's threatening a police officer. Put the wallet away. Turn around. Hands behind your back." Thorne remained distinctively still. "I am not turning around. I have broken no law. I have identified myself. If you touch me, you are assaulting a federal official." Vance had heard enough. In his mind, this was just another defiant vagrant trying to bluff his way out of a trespassing charge. He reached out and grabbed Thorne's left arm, spinning him off balance. "I said turn around!" Vance yelled. He hooked his leg behind Thorne's and shoved. Thorne, whose balance was entirely dependent on his injured hip and his cane, stumbled. The heavy oak cane clattered to the pavement with a loud crack. Without the support, Thorne's leg buckled and he dropped to one knee, a jolt of agony shooting up his spine. The crowd gasped. A woman screamed, "He's handicapped! What are you doing?" Vance didn't stop. He pressed his weight onto Thorne's back, forcing the older man's chest against the asphalt. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" Vance shouted, reciting the lines he'd been taught to say for the cameras, even though Thorne was lying perfectly still, gritting his teeth against the pain. "I am not resisting," Thorne said, his voice strained but audible. "I am complying under duress. Everyone here is a witness." Vance grabbed Thorne's wrists and wrenched them behind his back, snapping the handcuffs on tight, ignoring the limit of Thorne's shoulder mobility. He ratcheted the cuffs until they bit into the skin. "You're under arrest for trespassing, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct," Vance panted, standing up and hauling Thorne to his feet by the handcuffs. Thorne cried out in pain as his bad hip took the weight his cane left lying in the dust. Brent Miller, the cheese vendor, watched from his stall. He had wanted the loiterer gone, but as he watched the police officer drag a limping, well-dressed older man away, while the crowd held up their phones recording every second, a knot of dread formed in his stomach. Miller saw the way the man held his head high, even while in pain. He saw the quality of the man's clothes now that he was closer. He saw the anger in the faces of his regular customers. "That's a veteran," someone shouted from the crowd. "He has a Purple Heart license plate. I saw his car," another man yelled. Miller realized with a sinking feeling that he had just made a very, very bad phone call. Vance marched Thorne through the market, pushing him forward whenever he slowed down due to his limp. "Pick up the pace," Vance hissed. "My cane," Thorne said. "I need my cane." "You should have thought of that before you resisted," Vance sneered. He didn't retrieve the cane. A bystander, a teenage girl, ran forward and grabbed the cane from the ground. "Officer!" "You forgot his cane?" she yelled. Vance ignored her. He shoved Thorne against the side of the patrol car. "Spread your legs." He patted Thorne down, roughly emptying his pockets. He found the keys to a Mercedes. He found a money clip with $200 in cash. He found the federal ID again. He tossed them all onto the hood of the car like contraband. "Get in," Vance ordered, shoving Thorne's head down as he maneuvered him into the cramped back seat of the cruiser. Thorne sat awkwardly, his hip throbbing with a dull, sickening fire. He closed his eyes for a moment, composing himself. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He began to memorize. He memorized the time, 10:14 a.m. He memorized the officer's nameplate, K. Vance. He memorized the car number 402. He prepared his report in his head. Vance climbed into the front seat, pumped with adrenaline, feeling like he had just neutralized a major threat. He radioed dispatch. "One in custody, resisting, bringing him in." The drive to the precinct took 15 minutes. Vance played loud rock music, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, completely unaware that he was driving a hearse for his own career. Thorne sat in silence, staring at the cage separation, breathing through the pain in his leg. They arrived at the station, and Vance hauled Thorne out, parading him through the back entrance into the booking area. The booking room was busy. Sergeant Reynolds, the watch commander, was sitting at the high desk. Reynolds was 55, a 30-year veteran who had seen it all. He knew Vance. He knew Vance was a liability. When he saw Vance dragging a limping man in business casual dress handcuffed, his eyes narrowed. "What do we have here, Vance?" Reynolds asked, his voice low. "Trespassing at the farmer's market. Suspect refused to leave, caused a scene, resisted arrest. Claimed to be some kind of federal agent," Vance said, dropping the evidence bag containing Thorne's wallet and keys on the desk. Reynolds looked at Thorne. He saw the haircut high and tight graying at the temples. He saw the bearing. He saw the pain in the man's eyes, but also the fury. "Sir," Reynolds said to Thorne, bypassing Vance. "Are you injured?" "I have a service-connected injury to my left hip and lower spine," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Your officer kicked my cane away and forced me to walk on it. I require medical attention. But first, I require you to look at the credentials in that wallet." Reynolds opened the bag. He took out the leather wallet. He flipped it open. He froze. He knew what a PIV card looked like. He knew what a federal liaison badge looked like. He looked at the name. Marcus Thorne. Colonel USMC retired. Federal liaison. Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Vance, who was smirking, waiting for a pat on the back. "Vance," Reynolds said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "Did you verify these credentials?" Vance shrugged. He flashed it. Looked fake. I told him to show a license he refused. Reynolds slammed his hand on the desk, making Vance jump. You idiot. You absolute moron. Reynolds picked up the phone and dialed the number on the back of the ID card. He put it on speaker. Federal Protective Service verification line. A voice answered. This is Sergeant Reynolds, Oak Creek PD. I need to verify a credential for Marcus Thorne. There was a pause. 1 moment. Verified. Colonel Marcus Thorne is a Level 5 federal liaison with top-secret clearance. He is the direct representative for the Secretary of Veterans Affairs in your region. Is there a problem? Sergeant Colonel Thorne is scheduled to be on a call with the governor in an hour. Reynolds hung up the phone. The room was deadly silent. Every officer in the booking area had stopped what they were doing. Vance's smirk was gone. He looked from Reynolds to Thorne, his mouth slightly open. But he was loitering. Reynolds stood up. Uncuff him. Now. Vance fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking. He unlocked the cuffs. Thorne rubbed his wrists. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at Reynolds. Sergeant, I was arrested for standing while black. I was assaulted. My cane was abandoned at the scene, and I was prevented from meeting a homeless veteran who I have been trying to save from suicide for 3 months. If that boy isn't there when I go back, his blood is on this department's hands. Reynolds walked around the desk. Colonel, I cannot express how sorry I am. He turned to Vance, gun and badge, on the desk. Vance blinked. Sarge, come on. It was a mistake. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't check, Reynolds roared. You profiled a federal official, you utilized excessive force, and you ignored a valid federal ID. You are done. Gun and badge. Now. Vance slowly unholstered his weapon and placed it on the counter. He unpinned his badge. He looked smaller now, just a young man in a polyester shirt who had made a terrible calculation. Thorne refused the offer of an ambulance. He demanded a ride back to the market. Reynolds drove him personally. When they arrived, the market was in chaos. People were still gathered talking about the arrest. Thorne got out of the car, leaning heavily on the cane that a witness had turned into the police information booth. He went to the spot. David was gone. The young veteran, spooked by the police presence, had fled. Thorne stood there, clutching his cane, and for the first time his composure cracked. He looked at the empty space where he could have saved a life, and a single tear traced a path down his cheek. Then he turned to Reynolds. I want the name of the man who called 911. The fallout was swift, brutal, and public. The video of Vance knocking the cane away from a crippled war hero hit the internet at 2:00 p.m. By 5:00 p.m., it had 3 million views. The headlines were scathing: hero in handcuffs, police assault disabled veteran. Federal official arrested for waiting at market. The public outrage was not just local, it was national. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs released a statement condemning the arrest. The Marine Corps Association demanded an investigation. Kyle Vance was fired 4 days later. The union didn't even fight it. The optics were too toxic. His unfallible judgment had been exposed as nothing more than prejudice wrapped in authority. He was decertified, meaning he could never work in law enforcement again. But the consequences didn't stop with him. Brent Miller, the cheese stall owner, was identified by internet sleuths. The reviews for Miller's artisanal cheeses tanked. Locals boycotted his stall. He tried to issue an apology, claiming he was just concerned for safety, but the community wasn't buying it. Within 3 months, Miller closed his business bankrupt. The lawsuit was inevitable. Thorne sued the city, the police department, and Vance personally. The city attorneys took one look at the video, the federal verification log, and Thorne's medical records detailing the new damage to his hip, and they opened the checkbook. They settled for $6.5 million. But Thorne didn't buy a yacht. He took the money and started the David Initiative, a non-profit foundation dedicated to providing immediate, no-questions-asked housing for veterans named after the young man he had missed that day, who thankfully Thorne tracked down a week later and helped get off the streets. 6 months later, Marcus Thorne stood before the city council. He wasn't there to scold. He was there to teach. The room was packed. "We tell our officers to trust their gut," Thorne said, leaning on his cane at the podium. "But when your gut tells you that a black man in a polo shirt is a criminal and a white man selling cheese is the victim, your gut is broken. Officer Vance didn't just arrest me. He tried to strip me of my dignity. He failed. You cannot take a man's dignity unless he gives it to you. But he did take my trust, and he took the trust of every person of color in this city who watched that video and thought, that could be me." He paused, looking out at the silent room. "I had a federal badge. I had a rank. I had the secretary of the VA on speed dial, and it wasn't enough to save me from being handcuffed in the dirt. So I ask you, what happens to the man who has none of those things? That is who you need to protect. That is who you need to serve. Because until safety is a right for everyone, it is a privilege for no one." Officer Vance is now working in a warehouse loading trucks. He demands ID from no one. Brent Miller moved 2 states away. Marcus Thorne is still out there walking with a cane, cutting through red tape, fighting for the men and women this country often forgets. He won. But as he sits in his office rubbing his aching hip, looking at the framed photo of the day he was arrested that he keeps on his desk as a reminder, he knows that the battle isn't over. It never really is. Thank you for watching. It's easy to look at a story like this and feel anger. But anger without action is just energy wasted. We have to demand better training, better accountability, and better laws that punish those who weaponize the police against their neighbors. What do you think should happen to people who make false 911 calls based on bias? Should they face jail time? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe these stories matter, if you believe the truth needs a spotlight, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep the lights on and the truth loud. Until next time, take care of each other.